Just want to say hello to everybody. My name is Jennifer Falk. I'm the Director of Development here at MS Views and News, and I'm here with Sheila Thorne, who is our very special guest presenter here tonight with race, culture, and community while living with multiple sclerosis. Tonight we're talking about the Hispanic Latino experience, and we're just excited to have you all on. If you haven't been on before, welcome. Let's see who we have joining us. People from all over the country and all over the world tonight. We have Jim from Tennessee. Kent in Georgia is excited to learn. Linda in West Palm Beach says thank you, and I'm looking forward to learning about this. Lori from Florida has been looking forward to this. Hi, Lori. Marilyn from California is happy to be involved. And Dana is here from Ohio. We have people from New Jersey, Minnesota. Jesse from Los Angeles, California. Hi, Jesse. And Maria Teresa from Medellin, Colombia. Maria, Alabama, Virginia. So we've got a lot of people with us tonight, so welcome everybody. I want to thank you for being with us tonight, and even more, I also have to and want to thank our supporters for tonight's event, Novartis, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Biogen for recognizing the importance of tonight's topic and supporting this series. We thank you for that. In this series, we're exploring how culture and community play a role in the experience of people living with multiple sclerosis, or really with any health challenge. This goes beyond multiple sclerosis and can really be applied to more than that. So we're hoping to build awareness and to really understand critical issues in health inequities. And Sheila's really going to open that up to us and for us tonight. I want you all to know there's a question box. You should see it on the right-hand side or somewhere on the side of your screen. It's orange arrow, and you can click on that and you can type in any questions, any comments you want to share. It's anonymous. Nobody can see it except I can see it, and I can relay it to Sheila at the end. So feel free to write and share your thoughts. We'd love to see it. And I'd like to introduce you and share a little bit more about our presenter. And I'm sorry if you hear my dogs barking. But let me introduce you to Sheila Thorne. She is recognized as one of the nation's leading experts in multicultural healthcare and cultural competency delivery. She has spent almost 3 decades designing health marketing, media, and health education programs for racially diverse populations, with a commitment to raise awareness of the need to eliminate health disparities and distribute culturally relevant health education. And that's what we are doing here tonight. So welcome, Ms. Sheila Thorne.
Muchas gracias, Jennifer. Buenas noches a todos y bienvenidos. Para mí es un gran placer poder dirigirme a ustedes esta noche. Esta noche vamos a hablar acerca de la comunidad hispana, como aquellos entre nosotros que sufren de esclerosis múltiple son afectados por esta enfermedad. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank MS Views and News for this opportunity to speak to you about a very important topic. I had the privilege in 2002 to be part of a group that worked with the United States Surgeon General, Dr. David Satcher, to see whether we could get a month designated called National Minority Health Month. We wrote a resolution, we submitted it to the United States Congress, we had it entered in the congressional record, and April is designated as National Minority Health Month. So at least once a year, healthcare providers, healthcare professionals all over the country are focused on seeing how they can do a better job of eliminating racial and ethnic disparities in health. This month, I have the distinct privilege of working on how we can do a better job in connecting with the Hispanic Latino community in the United States. First slide, please, Bill. We're looking at America, which has become a microcosm of the global village. Over 200 countries in the world, every one of them has somebody living in America. So the United States has never had a homogeneous culture or population, but for a long time we pretended that it did, and we got away with it, but no longer. Clearly tonight, when we talk about the Hispanic Latino community, if you check that box on the census, you could come from any one of 20 different countries. I have had the distinct honor and privilege of working in some of these countries over the past 30 years that I've been doing multicultural outreach and engagement. I've worked in Brazil, I've worked in Mexico, I've worked in Puerto Rico, I've worked in Argentina, in La República Dominicana, on the ground. So I totally respect, celebrate, and appreciate those of us who have Hispanic heritage. Next slide. Interestingly enough, when people come to this country from one of those countries, Americans often say, speak English, even though there is no official language in this country. Over 500 languages are spoken in this country, 200 of them in the state of California alone. And if you look at the top 5 languages that are spoken in this country, Spanish is number 2. So if you're going to reach out to people in the Hispanic Latino community, it would be helpful. It would be appropriate for you to begin to understand the language itself. Next slide. But let's get some definitions straight, because I think people may be confused. Obviously, when we talk about race, we're talking about something that is a man-made invention. It's not real. It's a concept. It's a social concept. And it's something that people often relate just about physical characteristics, the color of my skin, the texture of my hair, the shape of my eyes, the shape of my features. These are arbitrary selections. So race, nothing scientific, nothing biological. Next slide. When we talk about culture, that's what people learn and how they live, what's acceptable. You learn your culture from your community, from your family. And that community and family teaches you what's appropriate, what's acceptable, what you can respect, how you behave. Culture is different. Race doesn't exist. Culture matters. Next slide. So when we're talking about different groups, we're really talking about ethnicity. That's the more appropriate term. How you group people by language, by race, by nationality, by religion. In fact, in the United States, for the first time in 2020, you could check 2 or 3 boxes on the census because there are multiple ethnicities that many of us are a part of. Next slide. But when you talk about Hispanic, is it a race or an ethnicity? Well, I'm here to tell you tonight it's an ethnicity. And in fact, it was a term invented by the US Census Bureau in the early 70s. And it pretty much just talks about people who are from a Spanish-speaking culture or background, regardless of their race or ethnicity. Next slide. And here we have a new term that has come into being, Latinx. We know that Latino, referring to males of Hispanic heritage, Latina, referring to females of Hispanic heritage, sometimes makes it appear that you have to be one gender or another. So this term Latinx came about as a gender neutral term to combine both. Hasn't gotten much traction yet in the country, and many people who are in this particular group don't even refer to themselves as Latinx, because that's a pronunciation that really doesn't work in Spanish. Only 3 to 4% of people of Hispanic heritage call themselves Latinx. You'll find the term used more by academics and more by journalists. It's very controversial. There's a lot of political connotations, but it is gaining traction. You decide which one you prefer to use. Latino, both groups, male and female, or Latinx, which is more gender neutral. Next slide. But now let's take a look at this group and learn some things about this group before we know how to reach out to them and hopefully assist them of living a quality life with multiple sclerosis. It's a young group. Clearly, those that are coming to this country are women, often in the childbearing years. So this group is continuing to grow unabated because they start out very young. Next slide. But when you take a look at the group, there's more diversity within the group than between. Simply because you're Hispanic or Latino, it's more appropriate to refer to you by country of origin. And the top 4 are Mexico, Puerto Rico, Salvador, and Cuba. Then you have smaller groups, which are also filtering throughout the country as well. So Hispanic Latino is a general broad term. It's more appropriate and specific to use country of origin. Even if you were born in this country, often many in this group use the country of origin of their parents or their grandparents. Next slide. And if you want to find out where these groups are, here are some of the top counties with the largest Hispanic population. Perhaps people in the pharmaceutical industry need to find out where they would want to reach out to these groups with health information. This is a great place to start, where these groups are no longer minorities. They are either emerging or already majorities. Next slide. Regionally, interesting to see how these groups spread out in the country. Largest group in the Southeast. Not surprising, farms are there. Many Hispanic Latinos that come to this country will go to that part of the country because there are jobs available. They come from agricultural countries and it's easier and the weather is certainly nicer. That doesn't mean there aren't Hispanic Latinos in the West and in the Midwest. There are pockets of opportunities of these groups in a number of different places. Next slide. Quite frankly, language is the common thread, but culture, depending upon the country of origin, is different. If you've been in this country a long time, you're probably more proficient in English. Newer entrants into the country may have difficulty in speaking English fluently. But even with those that are in the country, the use of Spanish at home is declining, mainly because many in these families and communities are going out to work. So English is something that's necessary and they bring that home. When I work in countries and when I work in communities throughout the country in the Hispanic Latino community, I produce materials in both languages because the same groups in each house, they're a generation. The older ones may speak Spanish more comfortably. The younger ones may speak English. So I do it in both. I don't translate, I transcreate because you cannot change one language to another directly. Transcreation is the more appropriate term. Next slide. And the numbers are just exploding. Almost 60 million in terms of the way the count was made in 2018. A large group, certainly a group to contend with regards to health information, and especially finding those who may be living with multiple sclerosis or who may not yet have had a diagnosis but know nothing about the condition. That's a large group of people, and it's continuing to increase. Next slide. And if you look at the nation itself, you'll see the pockets of where they can be found by state as well as by city. But look at the new states that are having emerging Hispanic populations: Oregon, the state of Washington, New Hampshire, North and South Carolina, Georgia, Nevada, Massachusetts. These groups are moving all over the country itself. So they, again, are either majority or emerging majority populations. Next slide. This is the area that many people don't understand. These groups do have insurance. If you look at the middle bars, it states there or shows us there that Hispanic Latinos, 25% are uninsured. So that means that probably over 60 or 70% have insurance. So many people are under the impression that these groups are all poor and on Medicaid and have no money. This slide shows us that nothing could be further from the truth. Yes, there are disproportionate numbers that don't have insurance and are living in poverty, but let's not paint the whole group with one brushstroke. Let's figure out and find out who is insured, who is uninsured, who is underinsured, and that helps us to do a better job of connecting with these communities about access to health. Next slide. Now we're going to really talk about the community in great detail. What I'm going to share with you for the next few minutes are not stereotypes, but they're what we call valid cultural generalizations, things that have been viewed and observed commonly in this group over long periods of time. It doesn't mean that what I share with you applies to every person of Hispanic heritage, but it will apply to many. Next slide. And here's what I mean by that. Here are 2 examples. A stereotype. Charles is African American, he lives in New York City, he must live in Harlem. That's a stereotype. The generalization is Charles is African American. He lives in New York City. Many African Americans in New York City live in Harlem. I wonder if that's where Charles lives. Stereotype. Maria is Mexican. She must have many brothers and sisters to take care of. That's why she works 3 jobs and she never goes out with the team. Stereotype. Generalization. Maria is Mexican. She's the oldest in the family and considers it an obligation to take care of her mother, father, and brothers and sisters. I wonder if that's why she works 3 jobs. So you see the difference? One is the trend. The second is you now have the responsibility to find out if that applies to the Hispanic Latinos in your area. Next slide. So let's get started. Next slide. Here's what has been observed in this group over long periods of time. Strong respect for age, strong sense of family and community, strong belief in God, especially elderly members, older members of the family, definite pride in heritage and the history, especially from their countries of origin, and certainly a feeling of wanting to be harmonious and in good relationships and cooperations. That's what's been observed. Next slide. Values and norms. Education is the key to success. Many come to this country for education because that's where you will find success and advancement. Respect is a central value. You respect people's positions. You respect people's age. You respect people's status. Even family situations. Mother's Day is a huge celebration in the Hispanic Latino community. The mother is a central part of the family. She is revered. She is highly respected. And a relaxed time consciousness. Punctuality is an inspiration. It's not necessarily a fact in these communities. It's more about relationships. And even from the educational perspective, over 40% now of Hispanic Latinos have at least a bachelor's degree. And there's been a huge decline in high school dropouts. So this is not only a group that has insurance, this is a group that is educated. Next slide. And communication varies with this group as well. Because of that respect, there's much careful sense given to listening. There's also a spontaneous expression of emotions. These are passionate people. They feel things very strongly. And when they do have those feelings, they express them. They minimize loud talk. They don't want to be misinterpreted that they're outrageous or that they're angry. So indirect communication. They don't want to offend. They don't want to embarrass. And that seems to be viewed, generally speaking. Next slide. And sense of self and space. Groups are very comfortable being bicultural. They're very comfortable with close contact, with demonstrating affection, even within the same sex. So clearly that's a very familial type of custodial type. When I work with my team, and I have on my team a woman from Cuba, I have a gentleman from Panama, and whenever we meet, we always kiss and hug, because that's just part of the cultural family feeling and closeness. Next slide. Latinas, Hispanic women, definitely a force to contend with. In their mind, la familia primero, family is first. She manages the household. She takes care of the children. There may be even senior, elderly members of the family living in the same household. There's a resilience. There's a strength. Espiritu. Whatever difficulties you have, you can make it through. And you depend upon your heritage and your family to help you through the hard times. And caregiving is a family obligation. You don't think of sending your elderly relatives to the nursing home. You keep them in the family, even if you can afford to do that. Next slide. And Hispanic men often are misinterpreted and misunderstood. You hear a lot about machismo, and that unfortunately has been given a negative connotation. What that really means is that Hispanic men are very concerned about being the man of the house and a provider for the family, hardworking, family-oriented. So it's not a negative, it's a positive. And hopefully not in a domineering or chauvinistic way, but clearly in a way that just says, this is what I'm supposed to do, provide for my family. Next slide. And we can't forget our millennials. These are the ones that are driving change, driving social change, policy change. They're very digitally connected. They're very comfortable with technology. They're very proud of their heritage, but they're also comfortable living in 2 worlds. They often don't speak Spanish very well, so they have this combination of Spanglish. It's a significant group that is leading the charge politically, educationally, and socially. Next slide. And our food and diet and body image are very different. And we have to divide it up. People from Mexico and Central America may like more spicy food, more carbohydrate based. Those from South America, there's more meat and vegetables and spices. And the body image, we're more comfortable, women who are from Hispanic heritage, with a fuller figure. And that may be the opposite. So weight management is often challenging because the culture is more forgiving of a curvier, fuller body. Next slide. But where does illness come from? In terms of these communities, usually three ways. Not only is it known to have some biological base, there's also many who think that there's a supernatural component to this. Mal de ojo. Maybe you've done something in your past life that wasn't very good, and now you're suffering illness because of that. Or maybe it's a psychological impact, ataque de nervios, or sustos. Maybe you were traumatized, or there was some violent effort, or you were shocked or scared, and that may be what's causing a biological reaction. And then, of course, there are folk diseases that people often refer to as the origin of illness. Empaco, something digestive, something about your core. So if you're in the Hispanic Latino community, you're not necessarily going to look for a biological reason. It may be falling in one of these areas. Providers need to know that. So clearly the origin of your illness is going to help that provider walk you through the best kind of treatment. Next slide. And the process of dealing with illness, self-care, religion, folk medicine are all part of the mix before you get into a health system. And that's important because the family, the community are in this process of dealing with any condition or illness. Next slide. And of course, there's always folk medicine. Curanderismo is something very common, particularly in the Mexican community, where it's a combination of healing, herbs, as well as spiritual and other issues that they feel would be helpful in bringing you to a cure. These are all things that are included in the Hispanic community. Providers need to understand that before they give a suggestion about what to do. Many of these communities are already doing things that they feel will benefit their health. Next slide. And part of that is go back one more, Bill, I'm sorry. Okay. Part of that is using whatever is in the community to help you. Botanicas, I work in them throughout the country because folks will go there for herbs, for teas, for anything that's of a natural basis to help with the condition. And the women or the men who own these botanicas are a huge resource in the community. And I often work with them to give them information about health issues so that if those herbs and teas should not be used, or if they're not strong enough to help, then at least there's another option. But you need to know that these exist in the community and many people will go to them first. Next slide. So what I've observed is the fact that attitudes and behavior about health in the Hispanic Latino community are important to address. One, when one person is ill, it's the whole family that's ill. Two, there's a strong preference for natural remedies, for organic remedies, because they feel Western medicine is too strong and it may bring other things that will happen. And lastly, the fact that you have to include the family in your educational process because everyone is going to be involved in taking care of that person. Next slide. But unfortunately, with all the advancement that this group has made educationally, politically, and socially, this has been a persistent profile in health. Poor health, lower level of awareness of disease, lower level of using services, no screenings, high mortality, comorbid conditions. You may have hypertension, you may have diabetes, and you may have multiple sclerosis. And once you find out about those conditions, multiple meds. This is troubling and disturbing, because obviously it makes it very difficult for the person to live successfully. And it also is challenging for providers in knowing what to recommend. Next slide. But again, this will determine, and this will differ, I should say, based on how long you've been in this country. Recent immigrants will depend heavily on family for their basic needs in healthcare. Second generation, The family will take care of children, will take care of seniors. There'll be counselors and advisors about health matters. And those who've been here the longest may still be attached emotionally to their family and to the country of origin, but they're usually more open to Western medicine and other treatment options. Being aware of this helps the provider to understand exactly how to negotiate health care with people depending upon how long they've been in this country. Next slide. But there we are with stereotypes. The media, movies, TV have unfortunately embedded images of people in the Hispanic Latino community that are not accurate. Either they're domestics and involved in a service for the community or by being maids, or they're landscapers. Surely there's nothing wrong with either profession, but that's not all that these groups do. And you may have remembered this movie that was out some years ago called Made in Manhattan. It was a very fun and kind of funny movie, but it still perpetuates that image of Hispanic Latinos and Latinas in particular being maids. And that's not necessarily how we want to brush the whole group. Next slide. And this slide tells you the three categories where people think of Latinos. Either they're criminals, part of gangs, or they're gardeners, they're landscapers, or they're maids. Nothing could be further from the truth. Yes, many are in these professions, and certainly we know that not all are criminals, but clearly there's a very diverse group, and we need to dismiss those stereotypes because they prevent good communication. Next slide. And many say, well, these people are poor. That's why we don't want them in this country, because they're draining our resources. Again, not true. Obviously, there are those that are, but there are many who are affluent, middle class, and well-established from an economic perspective. Next slide. So the stereotypes, if I can summarize them, they're all illegal and undocumented. They have bad tempers. They can't control their emotions. They talk too loud. They all look alike. And here's the real one. Intelligence of these groups is judged by their fluency or competency in English. I work with so many Latino physicians around the country who are well educated and who still may not speak English fluently because it's hard to learn a foreign language. Many of you who don't speak a foreign language should think about that. So there's not any relationship between your intelligence and your ability to speak fluent English, nor is it true about limited education. Next slide. But unfortunately, the disease factors seem to be common. And interesting enough, on this slide, they're more common with the US-born Latinos. There's something called the Latino Paradox, where even immigrants are seemingly healthier than Hispanics who are here. That's changing to some degree, but it may have a lot to do with your social network, your family, and your eating habits. Unfortunately, in our country, fast food and high-fat food and salty and greasy food seem to be what people are drawn to, and that definitely impacts your health. Next slide. And here's what you need to understand before you even get to the doctor's office. Many in these groups feel that they're not going to get the best care. They're pre-wired. So we may have to work a little bit harder to get them to believe and understand that we're there for help and we're there to give them the best advice about taking care of themselves. Next slide. And here's a really troubling one. Blacks and Latinos feel like they're going to be treated with disrespect. Why? Because of their ability to pay, assuming they have no money, or they can't speak English, or their race or ethnicity. Notice it's the highest in the Hispanic Latino community that expects disrespect. And unfortunately, sometimes it plays out that way. Next slide. And questions are not necessarily comfortable for many in this community, maybe because they're not fluent in the language, or more importantly, sometimes they feel it's inappropriate to challenge a physician or somebody that has status or that is better educated. That's troubling, because if you can't have a shared decision-making relationship with your provider, it sometimes takes longer for a person to get into care. So providers and other healthcare professionals have to be very unique about how they ask questions, not paternalistically, but to find out what's really making that patient behave the way they do and how they can work together to help. Next slide. And going back to what we say about the supernatural, many in this community, 26% at least of those surveyed in this study, feel that it's just luck, that there's nothing you can do, as destino. If it's meant to be, it's going to be, and nothing you can do to change it. Well, we've got to change that mindset, because for a lot of conditions, there's a lot we can do. But again, culturally, that may be something that you have to bring to the fore in talking to many of these groups. Next slide. And the health coverage, just to give a summary, as I shared with you before, these are 2017 statistics, and it shows that many do have insurance. And look at the last one, 7.7% of Hispanic children were uninsured. That's still higher than Blacks and whites and Asians, but it's not as high as many would anticipate. So the children in these families do have coverage, and there's certainly a group that many in the family really embrace to make sure that they get a better start in a healthy life. Next slide. Trust is huge. Many in these groups, these people of color, these communities of colors don't trust the system because they've been abused, they've been disvalued, they've been undervalued, they've been dismissed. And we have to deal with that. It's just the reality, unfortunately, of people of color in this country. Next slide. And that trust, that mistrust and distrust helps us to see that there are three barriers. There's a systemic barrier, there's a provider barrier, and then there's a patient barrier. So before the patient with multiple sclerosis can even get to the crux of how to manage their condition, they've got a lot of hoops to jump through. We need to help them make that easier. Next slide. And unfortunately, the history of this country doesn't make them feel very much that they belong. Back in the 20s and 30s, these were signs that were posted all over the country in various establishments. How would you feel if you walked down the street, if you were Hispanic Latino, and you saw signs like this? It wouldn't be very welcoming. That's the history. And even though, next slide, even though we don't have these signs blatantly posted, people of color go through microaggressions every day. When their culture is challenged, when their race is challenged, when there are assumptions made, and then behavior accordingly makes it very uncomfortable for them to feel as if they're welcome and that they belong. Next slide. And that kind of research abuse is what's led to that mistrust and distrust. Next slide. I shared these with the group before, but Puerto Ricanas and Mexicanas definitely were part of the group that were forcibly sterilized in the 30s and 70s. In fact, the highest rate of the sterilization in the world was among women from Puerto Rico before the age of 30. And that's troubling because then that distrust is fueled. Next slide. And quite frankly, even when you look at what happened historically in Guatemala, there were women who were sent into prisons to infect prisoners with syphilis, to see whether penicillin had a prophylactic effect. And there were also mental patients, next slide, who were deliberately injected with syphilis in order to test them. This is human research. This is abuse. This is known in the community. And unfortunately, that thinking has translated into being resistant of the system. It's very troubling. It's very sad, and it's very disturbing, and it's difficult history for us to hear. Next slide. These two women, Hillary Clinton at the time, Secretary of State, and Kathleen Sebelius, who was with the Health and Human Services, apologized for what happened in Guatemala because this professor uncovered those documents, and it happened almost the same time as Tuskegee. Next slide. But all of this trust and mistrust and microaggressions and racism and bias creates stress. And stress is often a significant trigger for attacks in many of these conditions. It exists. It leads to all kinds of things that will not enable someone living with multiple sclerosis to live comfortably. Next slide. And these are the reasons why we have to consider more than just having insurance and having money. It's those social determinants of health, where you live, work, play, and pray. Those have the most significant factors to contribute to outcome. It's not so much a genetic code, it's your zip code. Food scarcity, transportation, the healthcare system, safe neighborhoods, all of those things, because disease does not exist in a vacuum. It's in a social, cultural context. So you have to look at the whole patient and what he or she is living with every day in order to enable them to live comfortably. Next slide. And where the MS is concerned, here are the data. And I'm sure many of you know these numbers already. It seemingly is growing as awareness grows. Treatment is improving, but the research has not yet met up with the need. Next slide. So we have to give some serious attention to the prevalence of this condition, not only in Latin America, but also in the United States, or those coming to the United States. And here we see that Hispanic men, Latinos, are less likely to seek care and present later in the disease course and need more aggressive, probably very expensive treatment. So culturally, there's something going on there. Next slide. And part of what we know is that it usually runs in families. Unfortunately, it may run not necessarily in an immediate family member, but a cousin or an older relative. So the research is trying to unravel this puzzle. Next slide. And although there are questions, genetics is a factor, environment is a factor, and we need to really know where this comes from. Why is this increasing in order to better get it early so that whatever treatments are available can be more effective. Next slide. And in order to do that, we understand the prevalence of the disease and the severity, which seems to be more severe and higher in Hispanic Latinos. Again, is it genetics? Is it environment? All of those things are still being researched and studied, and it's important for us to be a part of that process. Next slide. So studies are necessary, clinical trials are necessary, a very daunting proposition because of the mistrust, distrust, and abuse. So we've got to work a little bit harder to educate those in the Hispanic Latino community in the benefits of clinical research. It's a process. Next slide. And clearly the backgrounds, what countries have they come from? What are the countries of origins? What are the socioeconomic barriers? So again, this is not just a pill or a treatment regimen. You've got to put this in a cultural context to get to the crux of how to detect, diagnose quickly, and manage the disease. Next slide. And the clinical trials, as we just said, are one of the most important ways to do that. And there's a movement in this country because of COVID-19 to really make sure that people of color are represented in clinical research adequately, commensurate with their numbers in the population. It's not good. We've got to do a better job to communicate, educate, motivate, and activate, because it will not only benefit the ones in the Hispanic Latino communities, it'll benefit all. Next slide. And men in particular, and men of any ethnicity have a hard time with healthcare, at least preventive healthcare, but this seems to be particularly prevalent in the Latino community, and they're not sure why. Maybe it's the comorbid conditions, maybe it's genetics. Again, more study is needed. The good news is it is being pursued in terms of finding answers to some of these questions. Next slide. And the higher prevalence of it also may be because of acculturation, of people coming to this country, becoming more involved in the American way of life, the American diet, the American lifestyle. There's a constellation of factors for this, for the increase, and we've just got to get to the bottom of it. And we need more specialists of color in neurology and other areas that will help really facilitate the relationship of the patient with the provider. Next slide. Building community partners. Next slide. If you don't know how to reach these groups, it's important that you connect with the people who really understand, speak the language, and come from the places they come from. And I've worked with all of these groups successfully over the years. They're a huge resource. Find them in your community, members and the chapters and affiliates, and they will help and work with you. Next slide. Even if you have to go to the point of national organizations, they exist too. I've worked in New York City with Alianza Dominicana, in New York in terms of the Dominican community, La Casa de Don Pedro in New Jersey, working with a number in the community, even the Portuguese in that particular group, and the Puerto Rican Family Institute of New York and New Jersey that I've worked with over the years. These are partners that you need if you don't look like these communities, if you don't speak their language, and you don't come from where they come from. Walk in the room with them. That's when you start building trust. Next slide. And the good news is this current administration is making a concerted effort to get more people from the Hispanic Latino community in positions that will make a difference for us. And these two, one that's going to be confirmed by the United States Senate regarding the census, very important hotspot, and also in the Department of Health and Human Services. So that's encouraging. You've got to look like the population you're trying to reach. Next slide. So, ladies and gentlemen, before the middle of this century, 1 out of every 2 Americans will be a person of color or a person of color who speaks Spanish. And clearly the rich culture, the rich contributions that people in the Hispanic Latino community have given this country makes them worthy of making sure that we're on the cutting edge of the research. That's the future. That's the future of America. Not a melting pot, but a country where these groups are respected individually for their ethnic and racial pride. Next slide. It's now my pleasure to bring on board part of this conversation, a woman that I've met recently who was very, very focused in her life about health with her family. And her name is Maribel Keynes. And I'd like Maribel to come now to the forefront so that we can have a conversation of what it's like for her to live with multiple sclerosis. Bienvenidos, Maribel.
Muchas gracias, Sheila.
It is such a pleasure to have you here. I am really anxious for you to share with all of those that are hearing what your life has been like living with multiple sclerosis. I am not a Latina, although I feel it in my bones, okay? But you're the one that has lived it. And I think your stories will help people to understand what it's like. First, tell us a little bit about you. Your age, if you don't mind sharing that. Are you married? Do you have children?
Of course. Do you want me to speak in Spanish or in English?
English.
English. So I am 35 years old. I have a son, thankfully, and I am married. I have been battling with chronic pancreatitis since the age of 2, and I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2018.
Wow, that's recent. Wow.
Yes.
So did it take long for that diagnosis to be confirmed?
Yes.
Why?
Honestly, I think there was a lot of factors. Not only me not really knowing how to communicate with doctors what was going on with me, and not really having any idea what MS was, because now looking back, I had a lot of red flags for MS, but I had no idea what the condition was. It doesn't help that I am Hispanic, that I do have a very complicated medical history. So my doctors, I feel kind of in a way have given up on doing exams and trying to figure out what's wrong with me, because I've already been through all that. And so they just focused it on, maybe you're not eating properly, you're eating too much, chile, or your body's inflamed because you're overweight, and they would just dismiss me like that. So I always thought, it's because I'm overweight, I can't move.
Well, what about your family, Maribel? When you got the diagnosis and you shared that with your family, what was their reaction?
I don't think they knew how to act. And till this day, I don't believe they understand what it is. I tried to explain to them. I've shared my story openly on social media. They watch all of my content. They hear my stories of, how much I struggle. I've even tried to do visually how my body feels by putting on makeup and, showing how my body feels bruised. And they just don't get it.
I think you shared with me you have a lot of brothers. You have brothers?
Yes, I have 2 brothers. And they don't even feel comfortable with me speaking publicly about what I'm going through.
Wow. Do you think that's cultural?
Yes, it definitely is.
Yeah, why?
Because I'm somebody that's Mexican, not Mexican. We're hard workers. We don't need to be complaining. We can do it all. Wow.
It's interesting you say that, because that's another stereotype. Either they think of Hispanics as working very hard, or they think of us being very lazy. There's no in between. So what happens if you have a flare-up or something happens where you have to go to the doctor? Do you go to the hospital? Do you go alone? Does somebody go with you?
No, I always go with somebody. Thankfully, I've been able to stay away from the hospital since 2019, because I had a horrific experience. I had never had such horrific experience in the ER as I did that time, because I was just neglected completely. I was profiled as somebody that was just seeking out narcotics. When I asked the nurse, nurses are usually there to help you and to kind of be that messenger between you and the doctor. And when I asked her to speak to the doctor, she spoke to the doctor, but not in a kind way about me. She was just kind of like, well, the patient's not happy. All she wants is narcotics.
Wow.
When in reality, what I was asking her was like, can you please have the doctor check my chart? Because everything's electronic now, so I don't have to wait for medical records to bring out my records. You have it right there in front of you. You can see that I have multiple conditions, that I'm not here every single weekend looking for narcotics.
Interesting. Tell me what happened. You shared a part of the story about your husband and your dad when they were very upset that you weren't getting the right attention or care. What did they do?
Well, I'll share about my dad first. Okay. My dad, since I was a little girl, he always fought hard for me. But it was hard because he didn't speak the language. He had just immigrated to the United States. No hablaba nada de inglés. And he didn't even understand it. He didn't even understand it. So he would always get a translator. And of course, he would get frustrated. And he would start yelling at the staff when they were just kind of dismissing me with the tummy ache, when in reality it was a very serious condition, which is chronic inflammation. And the staff at the hospital ended up calling CPS on my family.
Protective services?
Yeah.
Because your father was being very open about you wanting care? Wow.
Yes. And they tried to say that I was faking it for attention and to try to get out of an abusive home. So we were all interviewed. We were all separated. My mom was separated. My brothers were separated. I was separated from them. And we were all put in individual rooms, and we were interrogated and asked about our family life. And, it had nothing to do with my dad's temper. I mean, he never blew up at home. But they perceived it that way, that he was being rough.
And do you think if you were white, they would have behaved that way?
No.
Okay. And what about your brother? You told me something else about him as well, when you couldn't walk or stand up and he was not understanding why?
Till this day, I try to explain as much as I can. Like I said, I've even done visuals and I've done videos of how I feel. And he came to visit in December of last year, and I couldn't get up. And he goes, but I just saw you walking yesterday. Like, what do you mean you can't get up? I don't understand that. And I said, well, my legs are out for today. It's just, I don't know how else you want me to explain it, but I just can't physically get up. Or when he sees me using the walker, he's like, why do you have to use that? Are you just trying to get attention?
Interesting. Well, Maribel, I know you've lived a life for the last since you were diagnosed. What would you say to anyone listening that's newly diagnosed and they may be in the Hispanic Latino community and have met with what you experienced? How do you survive? How do you get through that?
A lot of therapy. But beyond that, I think creating relationships in the communities of MS, getting to know other people, and not just other Latinos. I'm talking just any other race, African American. I've met people from Ireland. I've met people from the Netherlands. From all over the world. I've connected with them, and that has helped me so much. Speaking about what I've been through has been very healing as well, because when people can connect to my story and to what I've been through, it's almost like giving me validation for what I've been through.
That's interesting. Well, you're dealing with it every day. Why do you want to go out and help other people, other Latinos? I mean, why not just take care of yourself? You seem like you have the full plate just doing that.
I think it's very important and it's very needed for Latinos to have a voice. And we really do not have a voice. We don't have representation as I would want to see, as I see other communities have their representation. It's been very hard to find people with multiple sclerosis that speak Spanish, who understand, how to deal with it, how to talk to their families about it. And I think the more we talk about it, the more normalized it will become and the more knowledge we can bring to others.
Fantastic. So what have you done in terms of the social media world, in terms of getting the word out in your interest and effort to help others?
More than anything, it's just telling my story. I don't care if I've told my story 100 times. I always get somebody different, connecting with me and letting me know that it has helped them in some way. And even if it's just one person reaching out to me, that makes a difference for me, and it makes everything worth it. My stress that I get, and knowing that I'm going to get that backlash from my family for sharing my intimate things that I struggle with. If I help out one person, that's my whole purpose.
Well, that's certainly heartwarming to hear, Maribel, and I know how proud you are of your family and of your heritage. As you think about these experiences you've been through, how do they make you feel when you may be dismissed or you may not be spoken to in an appropriate way? Does that in any way detract and discourage you from what you're doing?
No, it makes me want to. It makes me want to tell the whole world because I don't want anybody to ever go through anything that I've been through or that my family has been through. I don't want nobody to ever experience that. Everybody deserves to be heard and seen and feel validated, because these are living with multiple sclerosis is very serious, and it's very hard.
And you're in San Diego, California, and obviously I know that you've done a lot in the state itself, and I hope people that are hearing you and seeing you will be able to reach out. I think Jennifer, who works on this MS Views and News program, will make sure your contact information, if you would allow us, is shared with others. Would that be okay with you?
Yes, of course. Please. I would love to. I mean, if somebody just gets to hear, like I said, and it either inspires them, motivates them, or helps them not feel alone, and for them to share their own story, so then others can hear it, or even their close ones can hear it, it makes a world of a difference for me.
That's fabulous. Well, you're an inspiration to me. And I thank you for all that you do and all that you feel you must do, because I know how proud you are of your Mexican heritage, but at the same time, you know that you can live successfully with multiple sclerosis, and I applaud you for that. Last question, what can pharmaceutical companies who are developing the products and the clinical trials do a better job at? What are they doing a good job at? What can they do a better job at?
Honestly, I think transparency, being honest with the community. When I first heard about clinical trials or research, or I hear any of those words, it triggers me to think I don't want to be a lab rat.
Okay.
That's automatic. And I mean, I think with your presentation, knowing that we have been used in the past,
yes,
and have been lied to and taken advantage of, that hurts. And I think that's something that has affected many of the generations. And even now, me in 2021, I just started learning what clinical trials were and research and all that. And now I understand the importance of it for the community. But I don't feel like there's enough honesty and transparency when speaking to the community or others.
That's great. Well, you may feel like a lot of Black people say they feel like guinea pigs, so I don't think either one is good. Because it shows that we feel that we're being experimented on and not necessarily being studied for a good cause. So that's something that we have to change, and I'm sure that folks like you are going to make that difference. Thank you so much, Maribel. Thank you so much. And please stay, because there may be some questions for you, but I applaud you, and I certainly, wish you well in what you're doing, and hopefully that you and I can stay in touch and do whatever we can together to reach more Hispanic Latinos with this information about multiple sclerosis. because this is unfortunately not just one group. Quality, affordable, acceptable, culturally competent healthcare is not a privilege, it's a civil right.
Exactly.
Okay. Jennifer, why don't you come back on and let's see if we can get some questions done because we're close to our finishing hour.
Okay. I'm here. Thank you both. This has been incredible. Maribel, thank you for sharing this story. And that's not easy what you do, and you keep pushing and sharing your story. And I have to tell you just a little bit about me. I'm a social worker, and I've worked with people living with multiple sclerosis, specifically in Miami, Florida, with the Latino community. And your experience is very common, unfortunately. There's a lot of people that struggle in families understanding what an invisible illness is. And actually, I have a question from Hector, and I think, Maribel, you'd be wonderful at answering this. How do you recommend explaining an invisible disease to people in my family and community who do not understand this?
Oh, that's a hard question, because even with chronic pancreatitis that I've had since the age of 2, my family members, my grandmother, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins, still don't know how to explain that I have chronic pancreatitis or what chronic pancreatitis means. They just know that I get tummy aches. And that's been frustrating because nobody understands. With multiple sclerosis, it's even worse because it's not just one symptom that I get. So for them to be able to understand it, usually they don't listen to me. So I send information that I see from other people sharing their stories over to them. And sometimes how somebody else is saying it is different from me, and they listen to them and better than me.
Okay.
So I don't know if that kind of makes sense, but kind of hearing other people that are going through it, it's more believable for my family at least.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And, we have some other questions. Let me just see here what's coming into here.
Okay.
Okay. So maybe for both of you, how can the Hispanic and Latino community be more trusting to get, or how do they learn more about clinical trials and research?
Let me start that, and Margo, you can jump in. I think the information about multiple sclerosis need to be disseminated through a number of channels. I think sometimes you only use one way of getting the information out. You've got to use multiple ways.